The Lone Star State has a history of nightmares that feel like they belong in a horror movie. But the terrifying truth is, they actually happened. We're talking about sleepy suburbs masking unspeakable depravity and courtroom battles that tore the country. These atrocities didn't just flash across the nightly news. They overhauled our legal system, shattered our definitions of fairness, and made us stare into the abyss of human nature. Out here, where the horizon never ends, and secrets fester in small towns, monsters don't hide in the shadows. They wave at you from the front porch next door. In this episode, we are digging up 6 investigations that shook Texas to its bedrock. These events silenced communities, destroyed lineages, and turned the concept of justice upside down. Get comfortable, because the horrors that unfold in Texas echo across the whole world. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button for more dark, deep dives into the nation's bloodiest chapters. Let's start with Charles Albright, better known as the Eyeball Killer. The setting is Dallas, 1990 through 91. It started that December with a crime scene so bizarre it baffled even the most hardened veteran cops. Patrol units stumbled upon a female corpse dumped casually on a roadside curb in a sleepy corner of South Dallas. The victim was identified as Mary Lou Pratt, a 33-year-old street worker familiar to the locals in Oak Cliff. An execution-style bullet to the back of the skull ended her life. But that wasn't what made the investigators' blood run cold. It was the state of her face. Her eye sockets were empty. No jagged tears, no mess, just a clean, surgical extraction performed by a steady hand. Law enforcement stood in disbelief. This wasn't a frenzied attack. It was the work of a meticulous operator. They were hunting a surgeon, a scientist, or someone with a terrifying grasp of biological structures. For months, the squad chased, dead ends, debating if this was a lone wolf or a group. Then, more bodies appeared, bearing that identical, gruesome trademark. And Dallas realized a new breed of monster was hunting in their backyard. Charles Frederick Albright flew completely under the radar. Born in Amarillo on August 10, 1933, he was raised as the only adopted son of stern but affectionate parents. Dell, his mother, was an educator who drove him to excel in both books and the arts. Even as a kid, Albright was frighteningly sharp. He jumped grade levels, finished school ahead of schedule, and had a reputation for being incredibly dexterous. Yet, beneath that golden boy exterior, a darkness was taking root. He developed an obsession with biological forms and taxidermy, mastering the art of skinning beasts and fitting their empty sockets with glass replacements. That specific fixation, the eyes, would eventually become the centerpiece of his horrific legacy. A stint at North Texas State University ended in expulsion after he was caught swiping gear. By 1954, he was married for a short time and secured a teaching credential, yet he couldn't hold down a steady path. Rather, he bounced between gigs, educator, carpenter, football coach, all while keeping up a perfect facade for the neighborhood. To the outside world, he was the charming, educated guy next door. But the police files painted a darker picture: burglary, counterfeiting, and constant run-ins with authority. Even with a rap sheet, nobody flagged him as a violent threat. Until 1990. On December 13th, when Mary Lou Pratt was found, officers recoiled at the clinical way her eyes had been extracted. No jagged edges, no brute force, just pure surgical precision. Forensics noted the incisions were so exacting, it had to be the handiwork of an expert. Fast forward to February 10th, 1991. Susan Peterson turns up dead in the same district. Just like the first case, she took a bullet, and her eyes had been harvested. The pattern was undeniable. A serial predator was hunting the streets. Victim number 3, Shirley Williams, appeared on March 19, 1991, dumped by a schoolyard. However, evidence suggested the butcher was spooked mid-act. Williams had facial bruising, and the extraction looked sloppy and hurried, yet the gruesome signature remained. 3 targets, 1 neighborhood, all victims of a twisted surgeon. Panic gripped the metropolis. The PD mobilized one of the most massive dragnets in the department's history. Detectives pulled double shifts, bagging ballistics, grilling people on the street, and combing through databases for anyone with medical training or access to scalpel-grade equipment. They needed someone skilled in dissection. Initial theories pointed to a rogue MD or a mortician. Yet, as they dug deeper, the women working the streets began whispering one specific name: Charles Albright. A regular in Oak Cliff, cruising the blocks, flashing cash, and picking up passengers. A few girls called him a sweet old man. Others got a vibe that made their skin crawl. Detectives ran a background check and found a rap sheet full of minor offenses, but nothing violent. Yet, he ticked too many boxes to ignore. Officers put a tail on him and started digging into his past. They found an ex-biology major with a talent for taxidermy, who had been kicked out of several schools for stealing anatomy gear. That was a massive red flag. This guy didn't just know his way around a scalpel. He had decades of practice. A judge signed a warrant for Albright's place at 1035 Eldorado Avenue in Dallas. Once inside, investigators uncovered a disturbing stash: surgical blades, medical textbooks, and endless taxidermy gear. The most chilling find? Glass eyes, organized perfectly in marked bins. But the real break didn't come from a lab. It came from a survivor. Veronica Rodriguez went to the cops, describing a narrow escape from Albright's clutches. She guided them straight to his crash pad. That tip blew the whole investigation wide open. On March 22, 1991, police slapped cuffs on Charles Albright. At his residence, they bagged tons of potential evidence. But here's the kicker. Nothing physically tied him to the bodies. No prints, no DNA matches, no murder weapon found at the scene. However, ballistics matched shell casings from the crimes to a .44 caliber gun Albright could access. Add in Rodriguez's terrifying story and the fact that he was always lurking in the victim's territory, and the DA decided to press charges. The arrest sent shockwaves through the town. To everyone else, Albright was the friendly handyman and a church regular. The thought that a pillar of the community could be a butcher seemed completely impossible. But the trial kicked off in December 1994, with Albright facing 3 counts of capital murder. Without DNA to slam dunk the case, the state relied on witness accounts, connecting the dots, and Albright's creepy expertise in preserving dead things. The jury listened to stories about his obsession with eyes, his steady hand, and his late-night drives through the exact zones where the women vanished. His lawyers fought back, claiming it was all smoke and mirrors, arguing the cops were framing an eccentric ex-con. But the 12 people in the box didn't buy it. On December 18, 1994, the gavel came down, guilty for the killing of Shirley Williams. He got life behind bars without parole. As for Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson, their cases remained, technically cold due to a lack of hard proof. But the cops knew Albright was the guy. Even locked up, Albright swore he didn't do it. Over the decades, reporters and crime experts kept digging, fascinated by the surgical nature of the kills and the weird lack of forensic traces. The media dubbed him the Eyeball Killer, a name that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone in Dallas. Albright rotted in a cell for the rest of his days, taking the occasional interview but never spilling the beans. He died in August 2020 at 87. Now, let's head to Houston for Dean Corll, the Candyman, active from 1970 to 73. It was August 8, 1973, in Pasadena. As the sun came up, a terrified kid named Elmer Wayne Henley dialed the police. His voice cracked as he confessed, "I just shot a man." Police rushed to a small bungalow at 2020 Lamar Drive. On the floor lay 33-year-old Dean Corll, stone dead. Henley, just 17, was standing there, white as a sheet and trembling. Investigators assumed it was just a domestic fight gone wrong. Then Henley started talking, and the atmosphere shifted. He whispered, "You're gonna find others. A lot more." That confession sent police scrambling to a storage locker, and eventually to a locked shed on Silver Bell Street. When they cracked the door, the smell of death hit them like a wall. Under sheets of plastic and piles of lime, they unearthed the horror. Once the excavation was done, they counted 28 dead boys. At that moment, it was the biggest serial murder case the U.S. had ever seen. And the mastermind was the guy everyone called the Candyman. Dean Corll entered the world on Christmas Eve, 1939, up in Indiana. His childhood was a mess of fighting and moving. After a split, he bounced between states before landing back in Houston with his mom. In the mid-60s, she launched the Corll Candy Company, a little local shop. Dean worked the counter, famous for tossing free sweets to the neighborhood kids. That is how he got the name. To the locals, he was just the quiet, reliable guy next door. However, once the sweet shop shuttered in 1968 and Corll transitioned to electrical work, a shadow began to grow within him. He started dedicating his free hours to neighborhood youths, luring them in with complimentary alcohol, lifts around town, and a spot to socialize. To the outside world, it looked like simple generosity, but underneath, a nightmare was taking shape. It was roughly 1969 when his path crossed with David Owen Brooks, a local kid from the Heights district. Brooks viewed the older man as a benefactor, one who showered him with cash and presents. Slowly, however, the dynamic shifted from friendship to manipulation. He was being molded into a conspirator. Brooks eventually confessed that he received payment for delivering fresh victims to the apartment, usually tricking them with promises of a ride or a good time. For a long stretch, households throughout the Heights filed reports about sons vanishing, typically aged 13 to 18. Yet police consistently wrote them off as voluntary departures. No one had cause to doubt the unassuming electrician. By 1971, a 15-year-old named Elmer Wayne Henley entered the picture. Enticed by an offer of paid work, Henley thought he was signing up for odd jobs, only to discover the true nature of the gig was far more disturbing. He attempted to distance himself early on, yet the older man kept him hooked through psychological games and financial incentives. In the end, Henley transformed into a key cog in the killing machine, helping to entrap neighborhood boys using bait like job offers or social gatherings. Come the early 70s, the residents on Yale Street served as the epicenter of these atrocities. Those who walked through the front door seldom walked out. From 1970 to August 1973, scores of young males disappeared throughout the greater Houston and Pasadena regions. A chilling consistency marked these cases. Every single one occurred after the victim was spotted around the Heights, frequently alongside either the older man or his teenage helpers. The killer operated with a cold, ritualistic precision. After winning a boy's confidence, he would bind them, end their existence, and conceal the remains in lime-coated plastic wrap. His two young accomplices occasionally participated in the murders, while at other times they merely watched in horror. As the timeline stretched on, the city of Houston saw flyers for lost children plaster the telephone poles. Desperate families begged for help, yet an overburdened police force, skeptical of foul play, insisted the boys had simply skipped town. By the middle of 1973, however, the group's dynamic began to crack. The ringleader had become increasingly suspicious, convinced Henley was turning on him and threatening to flee. The tenuous grip he held on his partners was slipping. On the evening of August 7, 1973, the man brought Henley and two others, 18-year-old Tim Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Williams, back to his place in Pasadena for a night of conversation and alcohol. Once the guests drifted off, the killer's psyche fractured. Before dawn, Henley woke up to discover he was bound. His mentor was leveling a handgun at his face, screaming about disloyalty. Following a terrified negotiation, the teenager talked him down, persuading the man to release the restraints by vowing to assist with the next grim task. Yet, the moment his captor's back was turned, Henley seized the weapon and squeezed the trigger thrice, ending the man's life on the spot. Trembling and confused, he dialed the authorities. What began as a report of justifiable homicide quickly unraveled into one of the most gruesome discoveries in the nation's archives. In the interrogation room, the boy's narrative emerged in jagged pieces, shifting from denial to a horrifying admission. He spoke of the boat storage, the twisted operations, and the long list of youths who had vanished into thin air. Officers pursued his leads, heading first to a rental locker and subsequently to a structure on Silverbell Street. Upon excavating the hard-packed soil, the nightmare revealed itself progressively. Scores of bodies, encased in sheeting and interred with methodical precision, were found. Over the ensuing days, additional graves surfaced at High Island Beach and by Lake Sam Rayburn. The grim tally ultimately climbed to 28 confirmed dead, largely recognized via dental charts and belongings. This discovery devastated the families who had spent years hunting for their children. They finally had answers, but no peace. The sheer magnitude of the atrocities broke the community's faith in the system, leaving detectives to wonder how such horror remained hidden. Both young accomplices found themselves in handcuffs, facing numerous homicide charges. The 1974 trial of Henley captivated the country, resulting in a guilty verdict on 6 charges and a penalty of 6 back-to-back life sentences. His counterpart received a comparable life term shortly after. Henley is still behind bars, while Brooks passed away in prison in the year 2020. Unearthing this house of horrors revolutionized law enforcement in Houston. Detectives ceased automatically categorizing vanished youths as runaways. The department overhauled its protocols regarding missing minors, implementing specialized units and public warning systems that remain in use. Yet, for the residents of the Heights, the scars never fully faded. A trusting neighborhood turned suspicious overnight. Kids lost the freedom to roam the streets, and the legacy of the Candyman morphed into it left an indelible mark on the Lone Star State, serving as a grim testament to the fact that malevolence often lurks behind a friendly face or a warm smile. When the final body was pulled from the earth, Houston was a different city, forever altered. Yet, the public didn't have time to catch its breath. A new saga was about to unfold, one that would challenge the collective conscience of Texas like never before. Enter the story of Carla Faye Tucker. She was destined to become the first female put to death by the state in more than 100 years. Carla Faye Tucker, the first woman to face the executioner in Texas since the Civil War era, 1983 to 1998. It all culminated on February 3, 1998, in Huntsville. The clock struck 6:30 in the evening as the gates to the Huntsville unit's death chamber swung open, marking a moment the state hadn't witnessed in over a century. A hush fell over the gathered press corps. Outside, satellite trucks beamed live signals around the globe, while inside, the witnesses settled into their viewing positions. Strapped to the gurney was 38-year-old Carla Faye Tucker, appearing remarkably serene. Just moments before the lethal cocktail began to flow, she offered a soft smile to those watching through the glass. Her final words were a whisper of affection. "I love all of you very much. I'll be waiting for you on the other side." 15 minutes later, at 6:45 in the evening, she was declared dead. The history books were updated. The first female execution in Texas since 1863. The event captivated the world. For her supporters, she was a beacon of redemption and spiritual turnaround. To her detractors, she represented cold-blooded consequence. But to truly grasp why her name became a lightning rod, we need to rewind the clock to Houston, 1983. The nightmare started on June 13, 1983, Houston, Texas. It was the dead of night, shortly past 3 in the morning. 23-year-old Carla Faye and her partner, Danny Garrett, forced their way into the home of Jerry Lynn Dean. Dean was a 27-year-old mechanic, and the pair had arrived with a singular mission: heist a motorcycle engine. Dean was sound asleep, but the noise of the intrusion jolted him awake. Chaos ensued instantly. Garrett lunged first, initiating a brawl. In the heat of the scuffle, Carla Faye seized a pickaxe that was lying around for repair jobs. She swung the tool repeatedly. Amid the violence, 32-year-old Deborah Thornton, who was crashing at the apartment following a marital spat, was roused by the commotion. She attempted to step in. That proved fatal, as Carla Faye turned her rage toward the second victim. Neither Dean nor Thornton survived the night. By sunrise, law enforcement walked into a slaughterhouse. The walls were painted in crimson, the entry was forced, and the murder weapon lay abandoned. Investigators wasted no time tracking down the looted goods to nearby pawnbrokers. It took less than 7 days to have both suspects in handcuffs. Once in the interrogation room, Carla Faye spilled everything. She blamed a drug-fueled haze for her actions. However, officers would later take the stand to say she appeared to be chuckling as she recounted the grisly details a point her lawyers vehemently argued against. Regardless, her own words locked the prison door. Born in Houston on November 18, 1959, Carla Faye's start in life was rocky. Following an early parental split, she abandoned her education in her adolescence to chase a high. By the time she turned 16, she was roaming the southern states with motorcycle gangs, drowning in a whirlpool of narcotics and lawlessness. Those who knew her back then painted a picture of a wild child, gutsy, rash, and always valuing an adrenaline rush over common sense. Her path crossed with Danny Garrett, and they bonded instantly over a toxic mix of heavy substance abuse and dangerous living. That volatile chemistry accelerated their descent, crashing finally on that fateful evening. Following her capture, Carla Faye's Taped admission became the smoking gun for the prosecution. They backed it up with forensic science, fingerprints, the paper trail, and the pickaxe itself. The gavel fell to open proceedings in Harris County in April 1984. The state portrayed her as a cold-hearted monster, focusing heavily on the sheer savagery required to wield a pickaxe against another human. The defense countered that she was out of her mind on drugs and merely following Garrett's lead. But the arguments fell on deaf ears. It took the jury a mere 70 minutes to return a verdict, guilty of capital murder. The punishment was death. Danny Garrett was handed an identical fate, though liver disease claimed him behind bars in 1993. As the judge read her sentence, Carla Faye stood stone-faced. To the public, she was just another killer. Yet, once the cell door slammed shut, a transformation began. 2 years into her incarceration, in 1985, she started showing up for scripture study at the Mountain View unit. She described it as a total awakening, a spiritual overhaul that fundamentally rewired her soul. She didn't just attend, she led. She taught others to read and became a guiding light for fellow prisoners. Even the wardens and spiritual advisors couldn't deny her newfound peace and discipline. Word of this change began to spread beyond the prison walls. Those inside swore she was genuine, while reporters found themselves interviewing a woman who was articulate, gentle, and deeply sorry for her past. Faith-based organizations rallied around her, holding her up as the ultimate example that redemption is real, even on death row. However, her new life sparked a fierce revival of an age-old controversy. Can a saved soul tip the scales against the law? As 1998 approached and Tucker's final hour loomed, her situation sparked a worldwide debate on state-sanctioned killing. Heavy hitters like Pope John Paul II, the European Parliament, and major American religious leaders begged for mercy. Their argument was simple. Tucker wasn't the same drug-addled killer anymore. She was a transformed woman, and putting her to death achieved nothing but empty revenge. The other side stood firm. They couldn't look past the savage nature of the murders. 2 helpless victims hacked to death with a pickaxe, and maintained that the penalty had to match the crime. By late January 1998, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles delivered a unanimous no to her plea. Governor George W. Bush looked at the facts and backed the board, noting that while her turnaround was impressive, the legal system had done its job based on the laws of the land. That sealed her fate. Outside the brick walls of the Huntsville unit, the scene was chaotic. Crowds gathered, some gripping candles in silent prayer for Carla, others waving placards demanding justice for Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton. Inside the chamber, Tucker was the picture of calm. She used her last words to speak of love, absolution, showing zero signs of rage or terror. Those watching described her as serene, almost thankful to be moving on. At 6:35 p.m., the lethal cocktail began flowing. 10 minutes later, it was over. It was a watershed moment, the first female put to death in Texas in over a century, and it set off a firestorm regarding the ethics of the death penalty. In the aftermath, the nation-state split down the middle. For some, Carla was living proof that even the worst sinners could find God and change. For others, gender and jailhouse religion didn't matter. You do the crime, you pay the ultimate price. Today, legal scholars and theologians still pick apart the details of her final days. Over 20 years later, the arguments surrounding her death remain as loud as ever. It wasn't just about what she did, but what her death meant for us. Carla Faye Tucker made Texas, and the globe wrestle with the line between earthly laws and divine forgiveness. But 3 years prior, a different Texas tragedy had already gripped the country. This wasn't about redemption. It was a twisted tale of romance and blood at the Air Force Academy. The Texas cadet slaying, Diane Zamora and David Graham. The Texas Cadet Murder, 1995, September 1996, Colorado. The sun was just coming up over the Rockies when military cops marched into the Air Force Academy dorms with a warrant. They zeroed in on Cadet David Graham, a 20-year-old plebe looking sharp in his blues, shocked but keeping it together. Meanwhile, more than 1,500 miles east at the Naval Academy in Maryland, the scenario repeated itself. Authorities handcuffed midshipman Diane Zamora, 19, Graham's high school flame. On the surface, they were the golden couple, smart, driven, and on the fast track to military stardom. Everyone thought they were the epitome of honor, but within a few hours, the breaking news painted a gruesome picture. Both were slapped with capital murder charges for the slaying of a 16-year-old girl back home in the Lone Star State. It turned into one of the most disturbing headlines of the 90s, a romance that rotted into violence, where jealousy trumped the cadet code. Diane Zamora and David Graham first crossed paths in 1991 at a Civil Air Patrol gathering in Grand Prairie, just two teens with huge ambitions and rigid self-control. Diane was the valedictorian type, aiming for the stars literally as an astronaut. David was a star in junior ROTC and debate, dreaming of the cockpit as a fighter ace. By high school, they were locked in. To the outside world, they were the power couple, focused, faithful, and glued at the hip. Privately, though, things were darker. It was a pressure cooker of obsession. Friends would later talk about how possessive Diane was and how David would jump through hoops to appease her. When graduation rolled around in 1995, Diane headed to the Naval Academy and David to the Air Force. They vowed to make it work, convinced that a few states between them wouldn't matter. But it only took a few months for the green-eyed monster to take over. Come November 1995, David was at a track meet in Arlington. That's where he bumped into Adrian Jones, a 16-year-old runner from Mansfield High. Adrian was the girl next door, well-liked, sweet, and book-smart. They hit it off, swapped numbers, and arranged a late-night meetup just to chat, David would later tell detectives that things got physical for a brief moment. Racked with guilt, he spilled the beans to Diane almost immediately. Prosecutors say Diane didn't just get mad, she snapped. She viewed it as the ultimate treason and demanded a blood sacrifice to prove he was still hers. What came next was a scheme fueled entirely by fixation. To Diane, Adrian was far more than just a random teenager. She was a threat. The date was December 4th, 1995. The setting, Mansfield, Texas. Just past the witching hour, David pulled up to Adrian's place, claiming they were heading out for a midnight cruise. She accepted, completely oblivious to Diane crouching in the shadows of the back seat. They steered the car toward a lonely stretch of country road beyond the city limits. Once they braked, Diane sprang from her hiding spot, screaming that the girl was wrecking their relationship. The argument quickly spiraled into brutality. Diane smashed a heavy weight against Adrian's skull. When the terrified victim scrambled to get away, David ran her into the dirt and fired 2 rounds from his dad's .22 caliber handgun. They abandoned her corpse in the tall grass and sped off. As the sun rose, a driver noticed a strange shape in the weeds and dialed the authorities. Responding deputies discovered Adrian Jones face down in the dirt, life stolen by 2 bullets. The scene offered 0 leads, no theft, no observers, and no obvious enemies. The case went cold for months. Detectives chased down endless leads that went nowhere, unable to connect the dots until almost a full year later, when a shocking admission popped up states away. Come the summer of 1996, Diane Zamora was a first-year cadet at the Naval Academy, building a reputation for smarts and order. Yet, late one evening in the barracks, while chatting with a peer, she let slip a horrific secret. She and her lover had murdered a teenager back home. The friend thought it was a sick joke initially, but Diane told the tale again, insisting the bloodshed was necessary to prove their devotion. Disturbed, the roommate finally took the information to her superiors, who immediately contacted law enforcement in Texas. Facing interrogation, Diane attempted to brush it off, but quickly crumbled, signing a full confession. At the same time, David Graham was pulled in for questioning at the Air Force Academy. He also cracked, claiming Diane had manipulated him into pulling the trigger. With their stories aligning, police slapped handcuffs on both. The arrest exploded across the media. The idea that 2 model military students, supposed paragons of integrity, were actually cold-hearted killers shocked the entire nation. It was the only thing on the news for weeks. TV stations dubbed it the Texas Cadet Murder, while papers plastered images of the uniformed pair on every front page. America couldn't look away. How could 2 high achievers destined for greatness execute such a senseless act? The gap between their clean-cut image and their dark reality turned the saga into a cautionary tale of toxic romance. Since they pointed fingers at one another, they faced separate juries. In 1998, Diane's trial kicked off in Fort Worth. The state portrayed her as the mastermind, driven by envy and a need to dominate, using her own words and her roommate's testimony against her. Her lawyers argued she was a victim of David's mind games, that police coerced her confession while she was vulnerable. Following 5 hours of debate, the 12 jurors returned a guilty verdict for capital murder. The judge handed down a life sentence with a shot at freedom only after 40 years. A year later, in 1999, David faced his judgment day in Parker County. His defense team insisted Diane pulled the strings, but the state reminded everyone who actually pulled the trigger. He too was convicted of capital murder, receiving an identical fate: life behind bars with a 40-year wait for a parole hearing. After the gavels fell, the former lovers were shipped off to different penitentiaries. Diane went to the Mountain View facility in Gatesville, while David was sent to the McConnell unit in Beeville. They tried to fight the convictions in the early 2000s, but Texas appellate courts shut them down. Over the years, they've done interviews, still blaming one another, though neither claims innocence regarding the actual death. They sit in cells to this day, unable to seek release until the mid-2030s. Adrian's loved ones remember her as a radiant soul with big ambitions for university and sports, aspirations extinguished in one evening of twisted devotion and anger. The state was left with a stark lesson on how quickly bright futures can rot from the inside. When the courtrooms cleared, 2 potential officers sworn to protect were left to rot in prison. Yet, the Lone Star State had more darkness in store. In 2001, a mom from Houston named Andrea Yates would horrify the entire country with a story that remains devastating: the Andrea Yates calamity, 2001. It was June 20th, 2001, in Houston. At 9:48 in the morning, a dispatcher picked up a disturbingly steady call. The SP caller said her name was Andrea Yates. Her tone was flat, but the message was a nightmare. "I just killed my kids." Squad cars screeched up to a simple brick house in Clear Lake moments later. Stepping through the door, officers encountered a horror that would shake America to its core. The Yates home had fallen deadly silent. All 5 children, from the 6-month-old baby to the 7-year-old, were gone. One by one, they had been drowned in the family bathtub. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and little Mary Yates. 36-year-old Andrea just sat there waiting for the police. She didn't run, didn't fight back, and didn't try to hide a thing. She gave investigators a chillingly simple explanation. "They weren't developing right. I thought I was doing what was best." That single confession would light the fuse on one of the most gut-wrenching and polarizing trials Texas had ever seen. It forced the entire country to stare down the messy collision of criminal justice, religious fervor, and mental health. Andrea Pia Kennedy started her journey in Houston. Born July 2nd, 1964. By every measure, she was a model student, quiet, sharp, and diligent. She finished at the top of her class at Milby High, before earning her stripes as a registered nurse through the University of Texas program. Then, in 1989, she crossed paths with Rusty Yates, an engineer at NASA's Johnson Space Center. They tied the knot in '93 and immediately set out to build a picture-perfect life. Deeply religious, tight-knit, and laser-focused on raising a big family. From '94 to the year 2000, they welcomed 5 kids in just 7 years. But beneath that wholesome, pious image, Andrea was falling apart. The cracks really started to show after her 4th son, Luke, was born in '99. That's when the postpartum depression hit like a freight train. She retreated into a shell, barely speaking to anyone, while dark thoughts of self-destruction began to take root. It came to a head in June of '99, when she was rushed to the hospital after trying to hurt herself in her own home. Doctors didn't mince words. Postpartum psychosis. It is a rare, nightmarish condition where the mind severs ties with reality, flooding the brain with hallucinations and twisted delusions. They put her on a cocktail of antidepressants and antipsychotics like Haldol, which actually helped stabilize her for a while. The doctors gave her a strict warning: no more children. Yet, in the year 2000, Andrea was pregnant again with number 5, Mary. When Mary arrived in November of that year, Andrea's mental state didn't just slip, it collapsed. She flushed her meds, locked herself away, and became obsessed with the idea that she was a failure of a mother and mentally broken. Between March and May of 2001, she was admitted to psychiatric care 2 more times. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Muhammad Saw, later testified that while she was in a deep pit of depression and psychosis, she seemed to be turning a corner by her last visit. Against all odds, he signed off on her watching the kids full-time again. Disaster struck barely a month later. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Rusty headed to work around 8:45 a.m., thinking his wife was steady. He had arranged for his mother-in-law to swing by a bit later, just to be safe. He hadn't been gone an hour before Andrea turned on the faucet and let the bathtub fill up. Around 9 a.m., she began the grim task, taking them one by one, starting with the baby, Mary. Then she moved on to the boys, Luke, Paul, and John. She laid their small, wet bodies on the bed, tucking them under a sheet. Noah, the 7-year-old, was the last one left. The boy realized something was wrong and tried to bolt, but she ran him down. By 9:30 a.m., the house was silent. All 5 were gone. Andrea picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice was eerily calm as she reported the unthinkable. She then rang her husband at the office with a short, ominous command, "Come home right now." When the first responders walked in, they found her on the sofa, soaked from the waist down, eyes fixed on nothing. When they asked why, she explained that her children were flawed, and killing them was the only way to save their souls from eternal hellfire. She went into handcuffs without a fight. The detectives were rattled by her demeanor, robotic, articulate, and utterly convinced she was in the right. Mental health screenings confirmed the worst. Severe postpartum psychosis was steering the ship. She told the doctors that the devil was hunting her children, and she had to end their lives on Earth to keep him from claiming them. The state didn't hesitate. They charged her with 5 counts of capital murder. As the headlines broke, the country stood still. Texas is no stranger to violence, but a tragedy this grim, this unnatural, it was almost impossible to process. The case triggered a massive national debate. Was this a crime driven by madness, or the act of a cold-blooded killer deserving the death penalty? The gavel banged for the first trial in February 2002. The prosecution went hard, arguing that mental illness or not, she knew right from wrong. They pointed to that calm 911 call and her hiding the bodies as proof of guilt. They wanted the death penalty. The defense team pushed back, painting a picture of a woman lost in the fog of postpartum psychosis. A break so profound, she couldn't distinguish reality from her delusions. Psychiatrists took the stand, describing a mother completely detached from the real world, driven by religious hallucinations to save her babies from the electric chair. However, the courtroom gasped when Dr. Park Dietz, a star witness for the prosecution, took the stand. He claimed Andrea had modeled her crime after a specific Times Law and Order Times episode where a mother drowned her kids, implying premeditation. But there was a massive problem with that testimony. The episode he described never existed. Despite this error, the jury initially returned guilty verdict for capital murder. They showed mercy during sentencing, though, opting for life behind bars rather than execution. But in 2005, an appeals court threw out the conviction, ruling that Dietz's erroneous testimony likely prejudiced the jury against her. By June 2006, a new trial was underway, with the spotlight firmly on Andrea's psychological collapse. The defense team doubled down on her extensive history of postpartum psychosis and the multiple times she had been hospitalized before the tragedy. The state decided not to pursue the death penalty this time. On July 26, 2006, the jury came back with a different conclusion: not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge ordered her to be held at Kerrville State Hospital, a maximum security mental health facility in Texas, where she has remained ever since. The ruling tore public opinion in two. A large portion of the public believed justice was done, viewing Yates not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a sick woman let down by a broken healthcare system. Others were outraged, feeling she got off easy for what they saw as a calculated massacre of 5 children. The tragedy forced a national reckoning regarding postpartum mental health, driving significant changes in medical policy. Hospitals began implementing much stricter screening protocols to catch signs of psychosis and depression in new mothers. Rusty Yates, who finalized his divorce from Andrea in 2005, eventually remarried. Yet, he continued to advocate for mental health reform and publicly stated he held no grudge. forgiving her completely for the loss of their children. Over 20 years later, the saga of Andrea Yates stands as one of the most heart-wrenching chapters in Texas criminal history, less about the horror of the act and more about the sheer sorrow of it. It compelled the justice system to take a hard look at the line between criminal intent and insanity, asking if the law can ever truly address such complex tragedies. Today, Andrea lives a quiet life within the walls of a psychiatric ward, shielded from the media storm that once consumed her. But the memory of those 5 lost lives stands as a grim monument to the catastrophic dangers of untreated mental illness. Just as the state was grappling with this intersection of religion and madness, another nightmare was brewing, a crime so brutal it would leave a permanent scar on the city of Austin, the yogurt shop murders. To this day, the case remains a maze of contradictions. Let's go back to the beginning. The yogurt shop murders, Austin, Texas. December 6, 1991, Austin, Texas. It was just past midnight when fire crews raced to a call at the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in North Austin. It looked like a small fire at first. Thick smoke billowed onto the street, carrying the sickening scent of melting plastic and burnt sugar. The heat inside was intense as firefighters pushed through the front, but when they reached the back of the building, they stumbled onto a nightmare. Lying amidst the charred rubble were 4 teenage girls. They had been tied up, shot execution style, and set on fire in a desperate bid to cover the killer's tracks. Authorities later identified the victims as 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, her 15-year-old sister Sarah, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers. They were just kids closing up for the night, sweeping floors and counting cash, when the ambush happened. It turned into one of the darkest cold cases the state has ever seen. A senseless slaughter of 4 children that paralyzed Austin with fear and kicked off an investigation that has spanned decades without a final resolution. Back in 1991, Austin was different. It was a laid-back college town known for its safety, music, and family-friendly vibe. That yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane was a local hub, the kind of place where teenagers worked their first jobs and hung out after school. That Friday night, Jennifer and Eliza were handling the closing shift. Sarah and her best friend Amy had dropped by earlier that evening, just to hang out, planning to catch a ride home with the older girls once the shop closed. After 10 p.m., the foot traffic died down. The last customers walked out around 10:45 p.m., leaving the girls alone to lock up. By 11:30, the shop was dark and secure. Less than an hour later, the building was an inferno. Firefighters managed to kill the blaze by 12:30 a.m. Once the smoke lifted, the true horror was revealed in the storage room. All 4 victims had been shot in the head, their bodies piled on top of each other and torched. It was a clear attempt to destroy DNA and evidence. The cash registers were empty and accelerants were splashed across the scene. Homicide detectives immediately taped off the block, launching a massive manhunt. The sheer cruelty of the crime rattled even the most seasoned investigators. Word of the massacre spread like wildfire. Parents were petrified. If 4 girls could be slaughtered while working a simple retail job, nowhere felt safe. Schools organized prayer vigils, and the burnt-out shell of the shop became a shrine of flowers and grief. The investigation kicked off with heavy hitters from the Austin Police Department, Sergeant John Jones and Lieutenant Paul Johnson, scouring the immediate vicinity for clues. Leads poured in by the dozen, yet few held water, with early theories oscillating between a botched robbery and a calculated, targeted hit. Detectives grilled hundreds of individuals, casting a wide net that included patrons, close friends, and former staff members. They chased shadows across state lines, but physical proof was scarce, just shell casings from a .22 and a .380, some accelerant residue, and smudged partial prints that matched no one. Back then, genetic testing was still in the dark ages, offering zero assistance. By early 1992, the trail had gone cold. Despite throwing massive resources at the case, the suspect list remained empty. The clock kept ticking with nothing to show for it until 1999, when a fresh task force dusted off the files nearly 8 years later. Their sights landed on a specific crew of local guys who had been just teenagers roaming Austin when the crime went down. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. It turned out Pierce had been busted back in 1991, for packing a .22 caliber pistol, the exact same caliber used to execute the victims. Although that charge didn't stick to the murders, it gave cops an opening to sweat him and his crew. Under the heat of the interrogation room, Scott and Springsteen cracked. They spilled a gruesome story, claiming the gang stormed the yogurt shop to rob the place, only to slaughter the girls when the heist went south. Handcuffs were slapped on, and capital murder charges followed. But here is the kicker. Those spoken words were the only thing tying them to the scene. No prints, no physical links, no genetic trail. The prosecution didn't blink, convinced they had nailed their targets. By 2001, Springsteen was the first to face the music. The state leaned heavily on his own admission, paired with Scott's testimony to weave their narrative. The jury bought it, sending Springsteen to death row. In 2002, it was Scott's turn to stand trial. He caught a life sentence based on similar evidence. Meanwhile, the case against Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn was too thin to prosecute. They walked free. Initially, the community exhaled, believing justice had finally been served after a decade of waiting. But the victory was flimsy, and the official story soon began to crumble. The defense came out swinging, arguing that the confessions were coerced, bullied out of exhausted men with zero hard proof to back them up. They highlighted glaring mismatches between the suspects' stories and the actual crime scene. By 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stepped in. The court ruled the defendants got a raw deal, stating that using one man's confession against the other violated their constitutional rights. The verdicts were tossed. But just as the state geared up for round two, science threw a massive curveball. In 2008, labs ran advanced tests on evidence saved from the carnage, specifically genetic material found on the victim's clothing. The findings dropped like a bomb. The DNA belonged to an unknown male, definitely not any of the four accused men. Even worse, it didn't ping a match on any federal criminal database. The prosecution's case evaporated instantly. By 2009, they had no choice but to drop all charges against Springsteen and Scott, who were released after losing nearly 10 years of their lives. Maurice Pierce, who maintained his innocence to the end, died in a violent clash with police later that same year. Since then, silence. No other handcuffs have been snapped shut. For the grieving families, having the rug pulled out from under them was a fresh kind of hell. They thought it was over, only to watch it fall apart. Austin was left staring into the abyss, asking the terrifying question, if it wasn't them, who was walking our streets? The file remains open, technically, and detectives still dust it off periodically. Modern forensics dangle hope, but that elusive match hasn't materialized. More than 30 years later, the yogurt shop murders stand as one of the Lone Star State's most baffling mysteries. The sheer savagery, the legal whiplash, and the open wound of unsolved grief make it a textbook study in justice denied. Decades on, that little shop remains a grim monument to the system's failure. It serves as a haunting reminder that sometimes, even when the whole world is watching, the truth stays hidden in the dark. From Houston's quiet corners to Austin's busy avenues, these sagas peel back the layers to reveal a sinister underbelly of Texas. These are not just tales of bloodshed, they are stress tests for our laws, our faith, and our morals. From the buried nightmares of Dean Corll to the spiritual turn of Carla Faye Tucker and the utter despair of Andrea Yates, Texas has hosted crimes that transcend simple headlines. They force a nation to look in the mirror and debate the fine line between vengeance and grace, cruelty and care. These aren't just case files. They are the scars of a society perpetually wrestling with its own definition of justice. It forces us to walk the fine line between retribution and grace. Of all these Lone Star nightmares, which one chilled you to the bone? Sound off in the comments section. And if you're ready to uncover more dark secrets, go ahead and smash that subscribe button.